Thank you for reminding us. I live in Switzerland, not facing with any ocean, and I do know that my compatriots care very little for the life in oceans. But for us, as an academy, it's important to realize that we have specialists in that field, and we can trust them, and trying to help to our best. Thanks. Peter?
It seems that the reserves that are set up, while they're very impressive and worthwhile, and we love them, are we also finding ways to deal with plastics and pollution and dead zones, and global warming is still sitting out there, and so although habitat destruction doesn't seem to be proceeding at the same rate as it is on the land, there are a lot of other things besides easing up on fishing and protecting the stocks that may drive lots of things in the ocean extinct fast anyway. How are we doing with them?
We don't have the luxury of having any one silver bullet. There's no one thing that's going to change everything. Marine reserves certainly do not protect from plastics. They're not going to keep the water from warming or becoming more acidic. On the other hand, what we have learned is that most ocean ecosystems are susceptible to multiple threats. And the biggest one for many of them right now is overfishing. And if you can remove a single threat, then it may be more likely that the functioning of the system can persist despite these other threats that are there. And in fact, there's emerging good evidence that very large, fully protected areas are more resistant to and resilient. So both they resist change and they recover faster from environmental changes like a massive warming event. And so big areas in the Pacific that are fully protected did not bleach as readily as adjacent areas that were fished, and they recovered much faster after a very significant bleaching event. The same is true of pollution being dumped in an area. So I think there is good reason to believe, both in theory as well as with some of this emerging evidence, that creation of these very large reserves can in fact enhance resilience, not to the extent of having us get out of the woods completely, but buying time while we are also needing to address the plastic problems and the climate change problems and other things that are underway. So it's one of the tools, and I think it's increasingly recognized as being a very powerful one.
I want to elaborate on this, on what Jane has said, particularly in the context of extinctions in the ocean. When Jane and Paul sort of noticed the absence of, big things that have gone extinct in the ocean, some of that is a legacy of taxonomy. That as we get to know a lot more, for example, about whales, we're beginning to realize that there are probably a lot more species of whales than we once thought. How many blue whales are there? Well, there may be 3. How many killer whales are there? Probably a lot. And as we begin to unpack that taxonomic knowledge, then we start to see extinctions. The Caribbean grey whale has gone extinct. Was it a separate species? I think the answer today would probably be yes. So there's more big things than have gone than we have taken credit for. The second thing is that with all taxa, as we get to know more of them, we get to know more about the ones that have small geographical ranges. It's not surprising in fisheries that the things we know best are the big eatable ones, cod and bluefin tuna. And as marine conservationists, as marine taxonomists begin to explore lesser known taxa, cone shells, tropical reef fishes, and a lot of other things now, we realize that a lot of those species have very small geographical ranges. And as the excellent study that Jane mentioned showed, the more we know about a taxon, the higher the fraction of species at risk of extinction. There's a lot of small range species, particularly in the coral triangle, that are living in harm's way, where habitat destruction is a major threat to their survival.
A quick question. I can't help thinking there was a connection, but I have no idea how to connect them, which the size of the protected zone has some additional some benefits of the kind that you're mentioning, and I couldn't help connecting it with something that Neil mentioned in his talk earlier, that the long-range species have the greatest survival value. Is there some connection there, although they're speaking to two different points? But is there a connection that size helps? I mean, size in terms of ability to migrate in one case, I guess. Is there something?
So Neil, I'll start and then you can chime in. Bigger is better when it comes to a fully protected marine area. We know, for a variety of ecological reasons, some species move a little bit, some a little bit more, others a lot. The larger an area you have, the more of those species that are protected, both the ones that move a little bit and the ones that move quite a bit, not necessarily the ones that range for the whole ocean. Those species all interact with one another. And so so that's one impact. It's those ecological interactions that you want. Secondly, a larger area probably has more different types of habitats. And so that's an additional reason why that is really important. How that connects to the fossil record, it's hard for me to say more than the ecological impacts that I focused on. But Neil, if you want to.
What you're going to say, you're saying in that, the answer to that is it depends. It depends on the life cycle of the animal and the range of its life cycle. So it may have different stages of its life cycle in different habitats and different environments. And if those are contained within that geographic range, certainly would buffer from extinction. At least that's what the fossil record would say. While I have the microphone, may I use it to ask a question? Jane, I'd love to talk, and I wanted to ask the question, when we compare land and coastal areas to the deep water ocean, we're dealing with the difference in jurisdictions. We carve land and coastal areas up into multiple jurisdictions, whereas in large parts of the ocean, they're not in those jurisdictions, kind of much like in our, political jurisdictions. How does that affect the constellation of challenges and potential solutions that we would think about?
I think it is both a detriment and a benefit. It's always very challenging for multiple actors to get their act together than a single actor. On the other hand, once you have local ownership, there's a lot of pride and self-interest in making sure something continues, and it's harder to undo it. So many of the fishery reforms that we did, because they were led by and are championed by fishermen, are going to be harder for the new administration to undo, simply because the fishermen want them. Now, that's not geographically explicit necessarily, but I think the point is the same. The high seas are a huge, huge challenge, because it's been just this, what I call the wild, wild wet. Anything goes. And it is, there's currently underway a negotiation of a high seas treaty to look at what the jargon is BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, and to think about how do we begin to bring some rational decision-making to the ocean above and beyond the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which essentially just establishes the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones, but it doesn't really say much about what happens on the open ocean. So there are new opportunities, there's a new dialogue, and because of the SDGs, and especially SDG 14, there are new opportunities to begin thinking about how do we as a planet treat this very, very large area that we're increasingly understanding to be important to everyone. So the individual countries now are still needing to make decisions country by country. We're seeing them band together where in creating large protected areas, we'll have 2 or 3 governments that have adjacent waters do something together and do a protection that is larger than any of them could do alone. So the individual nature of all the countries is also opening up new possibilities for collaboration.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Lubchenco for all the remarkable work she did with the federal government in our past administration, which now looks to be such a benighted administration. I hope that returns back at some point. You can't say everything in a 40-minute lecture or so along the way. There's a couple of things that strike me as very interesting about the seas, and obviously those coastal zones and the lack of protection for so many of those habitats that have, part of, or a good portion of the life cycle of many of the fish that we're worried about on those coastal zones, and we're seeing the, high rates of destruction there. And that connects to the next question. It's a continuation of the same question, and that is that when you look at your graphs and then you look at continuing the business as usual into the future, and you see how many species are at risk and how many populations are at risk overall, there's a couple of things that come to my mind. One is that business as usual looks like it's going towards business as usual, one, but two, the human population's growing but also eating higher on the food chain, right, one. Two, and more people, for a lot of reasons, are eating more fish. One, because they're getting older and they recognize it as a healthier form of food. As people have more money, they do that. And so it seems to me that part of that answer, and you already mentioned it earlier, but not in your talk, is aquaponics or more fisheries on land. Those have their own problems, but I think that those are going to have to be some of the answers too. And I think they will happen whether we do anything about it or not, so we should be thinking about it and working with those companies to make sure that those are more sustainable forms too. So just comments anyway. Thank you.
I think relative to the food, the trajectories with respect to seafood, one of the problems is right now that the fastest growing segments of the aquaculture industry are not the filter feeders. It's the salmon and shrimp and high trophic level carnivores. And even though there has been significant improvement in the ratio of the amount of wild-caught seafood it takes to produce a pound of salmon or shrimp, we still have the situation where the most desirable types of aquaculture products are still acting as a drain on the ocean in terms of both taking food away from wild fish, but also from seabirds, from marine mammals, and from the important role that they play in those ecosystems. So the most sustainable forms of aquaculture are going to be the ones that are the filter feeders. But that's not where the consumers want them right now. So there's a bit of a disconnect. And so that may be another opportunity for social norms and preferences. It's an opportunity for the industry. Part of what we're seeing in the fishery reform is fishermen learning to fish smarter, not harder. So it's not just getting more and more and more. It's having less bycatch, being more efficient in terms of where you are fishing, and having, taking better care of what you catch so that it has a higher value. And so all of that is part and parcel of some of the changes that are underway in the industry. But in the end, food preferences are going to be a really important part of the equation.
Jane, thank you very much. That was most interesting, and I was intrigued to find what good. Pardon? Is that working?
Sorry. I'd just like to add another dimension. I think one of the things that's terribly missing in the marine side is some ethical questions. We're learning more and more about marine animals, but we're not passing it on to the next generation. And by the way, kids have been an enormous moving force in getting the environment towards the front of the political agenda. Children going home, I remember during the oil spill in Alaska, the parents from the companies of the oil companies up there were beat up by their kids saying, "How dare your company do this?" We all eat octopus, at least I have, but when you learn about the brilliance of octopuses, when you know that an octopus in one aquarium used to sneak out of its tank, go to another tank, eat a fish, and then sneak back and hide back in its own tank, you understand that there are issues there. The story with the toothed whales, particularly the so-called killer whales, is just incredible. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you what we know about them that's extraordinary. There's probably 6 or 8 or more species of them. Their sonic communication is incredible. Some of the species or strains, depends on which, are now threatened with extinction because of the damming of the rivers in the Northwest, killing back the salmon populations. And some of the killer whales eat nothing but fish. Some of them eat nothing but mammals. And when they mix, they don't communicate much with each other, and they don't mix their behavior. Interesting thing about killer whales, and I can remember maybe the most impressive predation event I've ever seen in my many years in the field, was a pod of killer whales attacking a Weddell seal on an ice floe in the Lemaire Channel in the Antarctic, washing it off and eating it. The interesting thing is these incredible killing machines, if you want to call them that, have never damaged a human being in the wild. A couple of tortured ones have killed their keepers in aquaria. And when you read what's happened to them in the aquaria, you'd have killed the keeper too if you got the chance. So I think if we got more of that information into schools and thought more about the ethical issues in some of the things that we harvest in the oceans, we might get that's more of the kind of norm change we need to actually care about them.
Yes, of course, I do realize that one of our conclusions is that the definition of a habitat is not only physical-chemical, but also the presence of other living organisms which are not too hostile, but which are helping each other. That's not easy and depends from case to case. It certainly is different in the ocean than on the land habitats and so on. So there is a big number of different habitats, but we always should keep in mind that habitats are not for one single species for living beings, because cohabitation is very important for many living beings to be next to each other, help each other. And as a microbiologist, I have become aware relatively recently of the big importance of microbiomes, both for plants and for animals and human beings. So in extension, we should keep that in mind. It's not easy to define, but of course hostility is going in the other direction, and we have a hard time to cure all of these bad situations. I think it's not easy. Yeah. So then you can give your...
Yes, thank you. I was interested in your comments about success with industry leaders, because certainly the experience that I've had in publishing papers related to the issue of plastics in oceans and pollution in rivers, industry just will not listen and will not respond. And I think we have to keep in mind this important component of industry. If you ask them, are they going to consider the amount of plastic that is being produced that is non-biodegradable or is only partially biodegradable, extremely difficult to get them to think of alternatives. If you ask the question, are you going to look at alternative plasticizers that are not estrogenic and do not cause sexual gender bending in fish, which I think is a dimension that we ought to include in this discussion about biological extinction. Again, there's a huge resistance from the industry. I'd be interested to know whether you feel there's anything more that can be done to bring pressure on an industry that is at the moment absolutely focused on the idea of maintaining the linear increase in production that started in the 1960s.
Brian, as you know, not all industry is the same. And I think part of the challenge is to get to the right, likely early adopters or leaders, and who needs to get to them. In the case of this Geneva dialogue, the industry leaders made it clear they did not want any NGOs at the table. They were tired of being beaten up by NGOs, even NGOs who claimed to just be focused primarily on science. And they were willing to have initial preliminary conversations. This took a number of years to get them to the point of coming together as the 8 CEOs, and there were a lot of one-on-one conversations, you know, 1 or 2 scientists, and working their way up within the hierarchy within these organizations. So it's not an easy thing to do. And as I mentioned, it's not clear that this particular effort is in fact going to truly be successful, but the fact that they were willing to sit down with scientists, come together, carve out 2 or 3 days, they insisted on making a declaration because they wanted to say, okay, we are going to change, and we've got the next meeting date set where we're deciding on, okay, what is this actually going to translate? That's hopeful. You know, it doesn't mean that we're there. And I think it is partly a question, and not all of the industries that are relevant would agree to talk. So I think it's, you know, if you can find the right circumstances and the right players, then change might be possible, but it's not an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's worth trying.